Mr. Bernstein, the floor is yours.
Hey, here we are. It's the Tinderbox Meetup on June 10th. I'm Mark Bernstein, the developer of Tinderbox, and here's Michael Becker.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's meetup. As you all know, our typical format is to talk about all things learning management, knowledge management, and their intersections with the wonderful tool that is Tinderbox. The typical format is we go around the room and we have new people introduce themselves and tell us why they're part of the community and what they're trying to accomplish. We'll then roll into any projects, challenges, problems, tools that people are working on and they want to discuss. Then if we have a theme of the week, which we do this week, we dig into that. And then we do any Q&A that we may have at the end. I may skip the let's work on our own projects and push that to the end because I want to go straight into our theme for the week. But before we do that, let's go around the room and introduce our new players. Let's start with our guest speaker of the day, Jerry. So Jerry, maybe you can give us a background, tell us why you're here, other than the fact that I invited you. And go from there.
That's hilarious. I'm Jerry Michalski. I'm in Portland, Oregon, where this week is lovely. I had a twisty little path sort of in my career. I was a tech industry trends analyst for a dozen years, during which time I learned about Tinderbox and a bunch of other things. And I've ended up working on trust and also on building a shared memory for people. So why are we drowning in the information torrent? Why can't we build a shared memory to solve our problems together?
Awesome. And Angie, I already kind of put you on the spot, so let me do that again now that we're recording.
Hello, everyone. I'm Angie Raymond. I'm at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, and I'm the director.
Indiana, cool.
Indiana, yeah.
You.
Hoosiers. And so, yeah, there's an inside joke in that. So I'm the director of data management and information governance at the Ostrom Workshop, which you got a 30-second intro to a few minutes ago. And we have, within the last 5-ish years, expanded into internet governance and data governance in the conversations about how these sort of different research environments can come together. And so Scott Shackelford does the internet governance stuff and does a lot of cybersecurity. And I do sort of the other side of it. When a nefarious evil doer doesn't break in, what happens when people are just sharing their stuff everywhere? So that's how we sort of divide the world. And I'm here today, actually, it's first time by invite, and I'm super excited to have discovered this group. Thank you, Michael, and thank you.
You've been seeing Tinderbox before. You've been drooling over my projects for the last month.
Of course, I have. So this is the first time that we were on a call yesterday. He's like, "Well, you're coming tomorrow at noon." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, of course." So absolutely, I have been. Yeah.
Perfect. All right, and I think Jack Keene, we haven't seen you before, or if I have, I don't remember.
Well, it was kind of a long time ago, but yeah, I'm Jack Keene. I'm based in New Jersey. My career has mostly been management consulting and very much knowledge management, although for years I didn't know what to call it that. Excuse me. But I've been developing both tools, intellectual property related to ways of organizing management data, particularly around value. So I built business case tools, for example, and now I'm working on a next generation way of articulating value. And right now I'm spending most of my time developing some management skill games. These are like board games and video games that you would play in order to upskill yourself in terms of how well you can do knowledge management, how well you can sell, and this type of thing. And I'm just fascinated by the whole history and progress of Tinderbox. And then all of a sudden, Jerry popped up on the radar here, so I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Yeah, fabulous. And Adrian, you have your video off. I'm not sure if you want to introduce yourself or not, but we can, if you do, you can pop off video. If not, we can move on. And then, all right. So Jerry, why don't we take it away? So the goal here was to have Jerry talk about Jerry's brain. And let's just open up it's like, is this maybe like Beam John Malkovich? You know, let's open up Jerry's brain and see what's in there.
Sounds great. Love to, and I probably should have mentioned that in my little intro. So in 97, December of 97, I was the first stop on the first press tour of this little company called The Brain. Basically, they told me much later they wished that the rest of their tour had been like my meeting, because I immediately understood it. Like my little wet brain saw this product, and I was like, oh, this is how I think. And I wrote about them in our newsletter, Release 1.0. I was writing Esther Dyson's newsletter at the time, and then invited them to our conference and started using the software. And the file that I'm showing you right now, this is the Brain data file, is the same file that I started in January of 98. So I don't have a second data file. I've been feeding a single mind map for 25.5 years. It's a little weird. It has more than 500,000 things in it. There are parts of it that are sort of janky and clunky, but I don't think of any parts of it as the dark forest. And I'll just do a really brief explanation here. I've been putting some of the people who are on the Zoom chat into my brain. Angie, I sort of didn't have a link to the Ostrom workshop, but I had a lot of stuff on Lynn Ostrom. So this is what happens when you start aggregating data for a long time. And in the brain, every node is called a thought, because of course it's the brain. You can attach links to thoughts. So this is a link to the Wikipedia page for Lynn Ostrom. So if I click on it, it'll send us off to her page. So anywhere you see a fave icon, that is a link to something, right? And then you can only link thoughts to each other by going up, down, or left through these 3 little circles called gates. And if the gate is solid, it means there's a connection there. If the gate is empty, it means there's nothing there. So it gives you a little hint about what's a little further away. And one of the things I love about using the brain is that you can see context always really quickly. So here's Lynn Ostrom. Her husband, Vincent Ostrom, studied common pool resources and institution analysis and development, et cetera, et cetera. Lynn did a whole bunch of things about sustainability and governing the commons. So here's the book, Governing the Commons. I use, unfortunately, some people hate Amazon, but I use Amazon for book links, and that also lets me see quickly that there's an Amazon link. That must be a book. This is a book mentioned by Howard Rheingold in his bibliography. He mentioned all these kinds of things. And here's Howard. Some of you probably know Howard. He's been around longer than I have and cares about this space as well. So this is just a quick go round in the brain. And what I think I'll do, I created this thought as this event. So I have my event schedule, which basically I use year, month, date to be able to scroll through the dates. And I create an event for each thing. And that lets me go back to an event and see who did I meet at that event and what did we talk about. I'll also mention one other thing, which is I run a community called Open Global Mind, where we care a lot about tools for thinking and talk about these kinds of topics. And we've been having Zoom calls ever since pandemic started. So here are all of our Zoom calls. This is a scroll bar down here. The call we had just last Thursday morning. We talked a lot about mortality, and we talked about all these kinds of things, including the founder of the Mondragon Cooperative and so forth. And then down here are some quotes of things that we said during the call. So this is how I use the brain for note taking. I did almost all of this during a 90-minute call. And then after the call, I downloaded the video from Zoom, uploaded it to YouTube openly, and then added that link here and added the chat to the text box. So I do that 4 times every week for 4 different OGM related calls that I'm on.
So Jerry, can we assume that anytime you want to take a note, you're only going to put it into your brain? You're not going to do it anywhere else?
So actually, no. What's funny is several things. Way back in 98, when I started using the software, I made a couple of decisions because I kind of know how software works a bit. And I decided there was a feature where you could index every page that you touched or added to your brain. You could add that to your index and make it text retrievable, the full contents of the website. I turned that off. There's a notes field in the brain where you can add notes. I don't use that very much. I don't add large media files to the brain, all because I didn't want the brain's data file to become this gargantuan thing that went out of control. I might not make the same decisions today, but I've been pretty consistent about that. And as a result, I don't use the notes field in my brain very much. I'll go open a Google Doc and then I'll put a link to the Google Doc in my brain. So I have projects and I have clients and I have all that kind of stuff, yes, in my brain, but I don't do brainstorming directly in the brain. I sort of do and I sort of don't. But I do use other software, which is sometimes just awkwardly connected. I mean, the good news is a URL is a URL, and I can add a URL to my brain and put it in the right place and find it again. I love things with good permalinks. And any website that messes with permalinks makes me angry. So like the New York Times is doing really weird things with its art, with breaking news right now, where permalinks don't actually work. It's just like, no, stop doing that.
Have you ever thought of using like Hookmark as for the universal methodology of linking documents on your drive and media?
So I haven't played a lot with sort of alternate kinds of bookmarks. I use Readwise when I read Kindle, for example, but I don't pay them for the added services. So I haven't hooked up my Readwise notes back into the brain, which would be pretty interesting. So there's a couple loops I haven't really closed. And I haven't done a lot to worry about permalinks. My answer to what happens with link rot is, hey, go to the Internet Archive and cross your fingers that the URL you're looking for was indexed in the past. And often, in my experience, 70–80% of the time, the archive saves the day and old sites are there. I don't do a lot of destruction or deletion of old links because like Nassim Taleb told us, we don't hear very often from the graveyard. And I think that hearing from or learning about, the companies that didn't make it is really important. And so I don't do a lot of flushing out of things. But then as you'll see, as we sort of talk more, I have breaking news. I have a whole bunch of things that I do. I'm always sort of building out in the brain in different ways. Kim, go ahead.
By the way, a total anecdotal aside on that graveyard story. There was research done during World War II when bombers were coming back. And so they were looking at the bombers and they were like, okay, how do we shore these things up? And so they were like trying to reinforce where all the bullet holes were. And the planes were getting heavier, they were getting slower and less manageable. And then some enterprising entrepreneur said, no, wait a minute. We've got to look at where the bullet holes aren't, because those are the planes that aren't coming back. Right. So the graveyard's telling us that, is not talking to us. And so what they did is they then started reinforcing the bullet holes from where there weren't bullets on the holes on the planes that were coming back. And then that started getting a lot more planes coming back, because that's where the planes were getting shot down, was, bullets in those spots.
Anybody know the name of the researcher who did that?
Can't remember. I'll see if I can find it. It's in one of my Tinderbox files.
I know I have them here, and I don't have it under bombers. I might have it under statistics.
Apparently, it's a chap called Joseph Banks Ryan. I'll just stick. There's a wiki page on it.
Survivor bias.
Yes.
Survivor bias. Here we go. Duke parapsychology. No, Joseph Banks Ryan was a parapsychologist and botanist, so that's not the right guy.
Hey, Jerry, can I ask you
Survivor
a
bias
question?
in World War II. Here we go. Yes, please go ahead. This is
Well, when you're done, I'm sorry, doing the research in the bullets. I got a bullet for you.
Go ahead.
Well, I had a question. Let me share my screen. I purchased the brain. You can start sharing with other. Okay, I see.
Yep.
I definitely use mind mapping is my life. I did my PhD on it. And so the brain is like very fancy dancing. I mean, it's a great thing to get into. Can you see my screen maybe by chance?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, I'm not a very good.
There you go. Now it's starting.
All right. So this is my manager. I'm not trying to A/B or trying to say this is better, and everything's different, right? Everybody has their different tools for different things. But I actually see there's a continuous linking of ideas. So I can actually have an idea here, another idea here, another idea here. I don't see that type of linking, and not to say there's linking with the idea of links, but just the idea of ideas of linking here. I don't see that within the brain. I can't find out how to do that and keep it consistent. And so another idea here, they're all tied in and broken down. They're like breadcrumbs. I just don't see that within the brain, how to do that. Maybe it's just me, but I think the brain's phenomenal. But I think, and same thing with Tinderbox, you can definitely link these ideas together. You can see the relationships between each one of them. How do you do that with the brain? And it takes
Um,
one idea and segues into the other one, and you have like a steady flow of
Sure.
relationships.
Why don't you let go of the screen and I'll share screen again
Yes,
and
sir.
show you how I would answer that. That's very easily done. And if the brain couldn't do
Yeah, I
that,
know. It's probably
I wouldn't be using it. So I'll go to enumerated wisdom, which is one of my favorite thoughts. The brain has very quick type down buffer, so I just typed enum and it showed me this thought. So here are the 5 R's of restorative practice: reintegration, relationship, repair, respect, and responsibility. This is a sort of a group of ideas. But let me go to there we go. We snip long-term relationships in finance. So I did a bunch of I did 3 videos about the global financial crisis. So here is one of the videos, but this is one of the nodes where I put together continuous set of ideas. So we snipped bankers and investors' responsibility for long-term outcomes. Mortgage originators became transaction mills, ignored risks. Rating houses became transaction mills, never said no, eventually rated trash as AAA. The government put, which means you could go bankrupt. You would never go bankrupt because you're too big to fail.
Sorry to interrupt you, but maybe
Yeah.
the government puts more important than the mortgage. How would you put the government put up above the mortgage? Mortgage organizers became. How do you do that?
So in the brain,
It's more important than me.
In the brain, if you put a period and a numeral ahead of a thought, it will hide the numeral and it will sequence the thoughts by that. I never use that feature.
Okay. Okay, got it.
I might say, hey, this is really important by sort of calling it out in some way, but I agree that some things are more important than others. And for me, that's how I arrange sort of the hierarchy of connections of ideas. But does this sort of answer your question?
Yeah, just the way in other words, I think up and down and left and right, and how do I actually sequence my brain in a contiguous, can't say the word, contiguous way of thinking. And that you just answered my question. I appreciate it. And I'd like to do a shout out to Angie. IU is great. I'm with her. You have great taste.
And I'll just say that this is very continuous or contiguous for me. Like this, the fact that I have up, down, and left, it's not just hierarchical. I can't only go up, down. The little jump thought is actually essential for me for doing this. So here's causes of the subprime crisis, narratives I disagree with about the subprime crisis. Here's a couple people trying to convince us of other sorts of things. I made the editorial comment, this video has lots of BS and loose reasoning, but I took notes of what the speaker was saying. This is Brian Wesbury, who is trying to spin, from my perspective, spin the crisis.
Yeah, great tool. Yeah, excellent.
Melvin.
Hey, Jerry, I noticed at the top of when you were showing your brain information, you had little tabs with topics like my beliefs, that type of thing. Are those tags, or are they more than that?
So let me go back to screen sharing. I just put a link in the chat to my brain, to the thought I just created for today's session. I will click to resync. So I have my beliefs. The brain, this is in the early decisions. When the brain launched, it didn't have thought types, link types, labels, or tags. I decided never to use any of those things, which may be a dumb idea. It's not that I hate metadata. It's that I could proxy with thoughts what labels sort of did. I found that the screen real estate, once you started adding tags and labels, got more confusing than helpful. And I love metadata, but if I made decisions also for speed, meaning I add 50 or 60 things every day if you do the math. If you divide 500,000 thoughts by 25 years, and if it took me 10 clicks to put something in because I would have to pick a thought type and a link type and this and that, I would probably add many fewer things to my brain. So I've optimized for speed. I would love it if there were some AI watching that said, hey, Jerry, it looks like you just added a book. Can I tag that up as a book? Can I tag the author up as an author, et cetera, et cetera? I think metadata is fantastic. And I'm hoping that there's a way to backfill metadata around my existing data through inference. And at some point we'll figure that out, but I haven't been able to sort that one out. Did you want to know something else about the beliefs or other sorts of things?
Just referring to the tabs, like how are you creating those tabs and the roles of them? Like what are they doing?
Which tabs do you mean?
Along the
I think
top,
I mean
it says
the
world,
pins.
new,
Oh,
new
so these things up
crew.
here. Okay, sorry.
The pins.
So across the top is called the pin board. I can pin any thought here. These do not move until I change them. So I have, for example, every year I change to the current year. These are events that happen. Here's the 2023 Ohio train derailment, for example. And then across the bottom are scrolling. This is breadcrumbs. This is the trail of all the thoughts we've been clicking on. So they're different. The pin board is where I put, so I have a thought because there's so much happening around GPT right now that I created a thought called We Are Now in the GPT world. And then under it, I have an interesting node. Here's a nexus of interesting things. Hot questions that ChatGPT's virality raises. How can we make the best use of generative AI? Is ChatGPT becoming conscious, et cetera, et cetera? Is it going to kill us all? And then what happens is, over time, the best articles about, is this thing a danger or a blessing, show up together. And then the best ideas begin to congeal. And I don't see other tools being good at doing this.
So can you explain that a little bit more? So how is the linking happening, and how does the associations occur?
All manually. Even though it's called the brain, there's no AI in the software. So basically, hot questions. I'm going to make a link right now between this and the thought neural networks. That's actually an article. Let's do applications for neural networks. So I just typed neural net, and it gave me every thought in my brain that has that string, that unique string in its thought name. And I just made a link between two things that are not related. So I'm going to break that link by doing a 2-finger click. I get a little menu that says unlink. So I've just made and broken a link. I can also drag a thought above and then put it back. That's really easy. So if I want to reverse the order of things or move things around, the column of thoughts on the right confuses people sometimes. These are sibling thoughts, and you can turn this display off. I like them because it's proximity. So these things on the right are children of a common parent.
Okay.
Right? So if I click back on this, the sibling thoughts that were on the right now rotated underneath, and they're all down here. There's a whole new level of deepfakes possible in the GPT world. Oh my God. What do we do? Right? How will we know what's real and what is fake? And then I have that under ways reality is under siege, which I have connected to we are already in a nonlinear war, which is a thesis I got from the documentary Hypernormalization by Adam Curtis, a British BBC documentarian who I really like.
Jerry,
So,
your whole approach is absolutely fascinating. I mean, it's just, have you done any documentation that would be publicly available in terms of your approach, how you organize this stuff, what's at the top, what's at the bottom?
Yeah, sorry. So if you go to jerrysbrain.com, you'll find a bunch of videos there. I've done mostly explainer videos. I have not written very much, so there's not a lot of prose from me about my use of the brain. There is a thought I have called Lessons from My Brain, and I'll connect that to today's event. So I just made a connection. All I did was I dragged from the lower gate, and I dragged down to the breadcrumbs where I saw this is the node that I created, the thought that I created for today's chat. So I just made that link like that while we were talking. So I have this. This is as close as I've come to kind of an explainer for what it's been like to use the brain, what's good, what's bad, et cetera, et cetera. So here are the user interface things that I think the brain gets right, and so forth.
All right. And then maybe if we don't mind, Melvin has packaged up a little demo from his own experience of getting stuff out of the brain. So from me personally, what got me into Tinderbox was, or what I'm so driven with using the tool Tinderbox is, how do I get stuff out? And then that was my personal big problem with the brain when I tried to use it, is I couldn't get anything out of it. And then into Tinderbox. And so Melvin's been playing with that, and he wants to show us what he's done.
Yeah, well, actually, let's see, am I unmute? Okay. Let me see if I get the right screen up here.
And then also, Melvin, you raised your hand. Did you have a comment or question for Jerry?
No, I was going to say, I don't know why I can't get the, okay, you can see the brain?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. No, I had it up there because I wanted to show I have a much narrower use of the brain. I'm envious of Jerry's, but mine is basically to use it for bibliographical purposes for my research. And since Eleanor Ostrom was a theme here, I took Eleanor Ostrom for NSF short course back in 1974.
Oh, how cool.
Yeah, and then in the 1990s, she was kind enough to appoint me the head of task force with her, to co-chair when she was head of the American Political Science Association. So Lynn's a hero of mine, and I've collected, this is my bibliography of Lynn Ostrom. Again, Vincent is down there.
Hey, by the way, Angie, too, that wasn't planned. So,
right.
Melvin, you and Angie should connect. That's a
right. Yeah, no.
serendipity.
I wrote her a little side note about that. So it's but I have this. Let's see. This is one where there is a PDF. So I do use the notes in the index side. So if I go back to just to show you what the index was, I didn't know there was an option to turn it off, but there's the index in the sense that everything that mentions Eleanor Ostrom, all the different parts are there. And again, I have individual pieces with the PDF attached. This is the book, Princeton University book. But I just wanted to show, and it says mine is much more limited. What I do is basically highlight the different keywords or key ideas that I wanted to highlight. And so this is her approach to that, the institutional analysis and development. And so again, I have sort of a index part of it. This isn't quite, again, my bookends collection is about twice the size of this. So I'm just using this as an intermediary point with my bibliography. The demo I was going to do, and I don't know whether you want to approach that now or
no, let's do it now.
Or we could wait, in the sense that the issue, which Jerry knows the issue about, how do you get things out of the brain to be useful, so you might be able to import them into, among other things, import them into Tinderbox. And Art provided the key a couple of 3 weeks ago, and so let me do the demo, and I tried this out with Michael yesterday. So here I have all works by a particular author that I'm working on right now, Giovanni Sartori, and his work on conceptual analysis. And so the only way I could figure to move things out was to create a document. And here I have choices about what kind of document I want to create. A PDF, and again, it has all these links in them. An HTML, almost identical. The Markdown was the one that seemed to work, or seemed to work best. So the problem with the Markdown, and the difference between the Markdown option and the PDF option, is that the links are not included in the Markdown one. There's also a plain text option as well. So again, just to
and Jerry and or Melvin, when you say links, you mean both the internal brain links or external links?
Right, the internal links and the mention, basically the things that are over in that index side over here.
Okay. And by the way, I noticed it says convert to common mark. You know, the Tinderbox is natively common mark Markdown. I don't know if you knew that.
Yeah, again, I'm such an amateur at this stuff. I don't even know what Markdown differences are. But anyway, what we did yesterday, just to show how far you can go, and you can't go very far, is save this and having to solve the problem that it happens to come up in, put down, Markdown.
So right now, Melvin's got his Markdown files are associated with Ulysses on his hard drive, or on his computer.
Yeah,
If he tries to open a Markdown file, it opens up Ulysses.
Although I could probably take them from the Finder as well. Okay, let me bring up the Tinderbox. Okay.
You create the document. Where's that at? Where's that pull down for doc? Sorry about that.
I'm sorry, what?
Could you say create document to export out to
Well, to an
HTML,
MD,
whatever?
to an MD file that I just, let me bring
Okay.
in. So here's the MD file.
No,
and
no, we
I-
can't see that, Melvin. Right now, we're
Oh.
just seeing the brain still.
Okay, let me.
I think you're screen
What
sharing
what I'm,
only
what
your
I'm
brain.
doing is basically bringing this over from Finder. Okay, let me go into outline, since one I know how to use easier. You can see the Tinderbox, right?
No, we only
Oh,
see
you
the.
can't.
No, there's no
Oh.
Tinderbox.
Sharing
Just
one window.
Sorry.
multiple brains there. Yeah.
Yeah, let me get to a different share here. So, how's that?
Perfect.
Can you see the Tinderbox now?
Yeah, so why don't you delete that note and redrag that over from the from your Finder?
Well, I did. Yeah, right.
No, no, can you do it now so people can see you do it?
Okay, well, hold on. All right, let me bring this over. Yeah, basically it's just the same move. Just bring it into outline form.
Okay.
All right.
Cool. All right.
All right. Then in the note explode. All right. Now, how did we have this yesterday? So the delimiter here is that these dots over here, the line. I'm gonna delete delimiter. I have the option of
Actually,
the title.
real quick, Jerry, I'm sorry, Jerry, Melvin, click the
Yeah.
remove title. Sorry. Because I
I'm
want to show
sorry.
Bernstein something while we're at it.
Do you want me to explode it again?
Yeah, and we'll just show people doing it twice. This time,
Okay.
explode it and click the remove from title, and let's show Mr. Bernstein, and he can explain to us what's happening. Now explode it.
Okay.
And then once you open up the caret, so you see now we've done 2 explodes.
Right. Okay. So let me show you the first explode right there. And then the second explode we did after that title change. It just
Yeah. So, Mr. Bernstein, real quick. So you notice when we did the explode, for some reason, for some of these notes, it's showing up the 3. It's taking the last character. When we remove the delimiter, it's taking the last character from the date and leaving it in the text. We're not sure why.
yeah. Right. That's when we moved title. So the first go ahead. I'm sorry, Mark.
Sorry, Mark.
Yeah, I just need you to send me the source for importing and the detail.
Yeah. Cool. So it's got to be some regex thing that we're missing, but it's just something that we wanted to show you. Yeah. But so the idea then is what Melvin's showing us is you can export a markdown file out of the brain, pull that into Tinderbox, and then find the pattern in your text, and then explode it out, break it into notes, and then do with it whatever you want. And then you can use the action code transformations to kind of dig in and mess around with it however you want.
Right. So we know, I guess, in response to Jerry said, they make it real difficult to take things out of the brain. But this is the one method that we came up with. And again, probably could have done it in the HTML option as well. What that does is provide the links back to the brain, or it's supposed to provide the links back to the brain. And again, the PDF might do the same thing. But so that's the issue for me from the beginning, and the reason why we ended up setting up this session originally was how do you get things from the brain to other places. And Jerry, you mentioned that you've talked to them about making it a little bit easier to play with other things like Tinderbox.
Yeah.
And Jerry, Melvin's the reason why you're here. Actually, is we were on a meetup, and he's like, I just really wish Jerry could show up. And like, let's ask him.
That's wonderful. I love that. Thanks, Melvin.
Sure.
Briefly, so the brain has always had several export features and functions. So you could always export something to PDF. You could take pieces of an outline, etc. I think that one of the real barriers is that there is no other tool that understands that up, down, left format. So the visual aspect of the brain, which is to me one of its greatest assets, doesn't translate nicely to any other tool. You kind of lose that lose that information. Now, a friend of mine who created a wiki called SeedWiki out of Berkeley, and I used to be his neighbor years ago, we started playing with stuff and we created a frames rendering where he could poke the brain and basically render stuff in frames on a page. And it looked pretty good. And the new web client of the brain. So when I send you guys a link to the brain, there's a little eye icon on the upper right. If you click on the eye, it'll flip between the brain view with the plex and the blue and the lines to a basically almost like a frames look. Same information, except now it's located slightly differently. So that's happening. But still, the brain doesn't really play nicely with other tools, as Melvin said. And one of my quixotic goals is to try to figure out what standards, protocols, or behaviors would it take for everything from Rome research and MEM and GraphViz, and there's just hundreds of tools. I'll pass you guys a link to mapping tools for thinking, where I've collected up all the various tools that I've ever seen, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them. How might we get these tools talking to each other better? Because I don't think there's one tool to rule them all, and we're each going to find our way to the tool that we're most comfortable with. How do we collaborate then?
It's a great idea, Jerry. Excellent. Mapping tools for linking.
I'm salivating to get that link. Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Yeah.
So let me paste the link in the chat, and then I will also do a really brief screen share and tour of that. Let me quickly screen share it. So here's mapping tools for thinking. I only created this thought pretty recently, end of last year. Spring of last year. And it has personal knowledge networks, personal knowledge management, personal knowledge graphs, participatory mapping, open knowledge networks, argumentation mapping apps, distributed knowledge graphs, and every one of these here's distributed knowledge graphs has Agora and Underlay. Underlay is a project of the Knowledge Futures Group, which is Danny Hillis, who originally created MetaWeb, which Google bought and turned into the Google Knowledge Graph. But his new project is called the Knowledge Futures Group, and Underlay is one of those projects. So back to mapping tools for thinking, maps of content, mapping tools, mind mapping as a whole category. And you'll see a lot of yellow and purple here. Typically, white is the default color for thoughts in the brain. I don't like to use too many colors. I use yellow to say there's a collection here. I use yellow to catch the eye's attention and say there's a collection here. And I use purple usually for opinions. In this case, it was just for more attention. But usually, like we are now in the GPT world, is an opinion of mine. And Melvin, I wanted to ask you, do you use your brain, like in Ostrom and all that work, do you add your own opinions, or are you trying just to do a good bibliography of research papers and other sorts of things? Because I find making this more than just bibliographic search is essential for me. Like this allows me to express myself.
Right. I haven't gotten to that point again. That particular brain, I call it my sources brain, but I do have a bibliography brain of my own work, and then for different courses when I was teaching before I retired, I had a lot of that came closer to what you were doing, but again, it was very course specific. But I've never used the brain in terms of a general thinking tool. Again, I've seen a few online. None of them match yours, of course. But I haven't used it for that general purpose. I've used it for very specific things like the bibliography, the course, and so on. It just helps me in terms of my workflow. I see the brain as a workflow tool rather than as a general way of organizing my brain, my real brain. So
love that. We've got Mark and Dave with questions. Go ahead.
Just a quick one. I was thinking about the import. If your the sentence detection works off a heuristic, which flags up the point that where a sentence ends isn't always the same to everyone's perspective, and of course we're an international crowd and not everyone's writing in Roman type, and all these things play into it. If you do get the wrong inclusion, or if you're trying to remove the title from the text, and you're getting an impasse at the moment, one thing you can do is simply not remove the title during the explode, and just run a rule to basically look at the beginning of the note and take the first line out, which is the title. Or if the title is being taken from what otherwise is the first paragraph, then you just use a regex to find from the start of the text up until the end of the title. And if that's too complex, we can discuss it in forum. There is a short-term solution workaround for that.
And that's the distinction between the first explode Melvin did and the second one, where we were ending up with that hanging chat, if you will, right? Cool. Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, after 20 some odd years of doing this, what is the value added of this proposition? And let me place my question in the context as someone who collects an innumerable amount of material in Instapaper, who has endless bookmarks that I sometimes revisit, sometimes never revisit. And to take the metaphor of the brain, or the analogy of the brain, that during much of the body's childhood development, an enormous amount of effort is put into pruning connections within the brain. So how does this resource inform your knowledge or your philosophy, your views of things, or is it just like a resource, a quick reference tool?
So it's interesting. This is kind of a Swiss Army knife for me. There's a bunch of things it doesn't do that I wish it did, that I'm trying to kind of figure out how to make it do. But I use this constantly for most of the things I run across. So current events, I never took a philosophy course in my life, actually. Let me just share screen for a second. I just went to synaptic pruning because you were talking about how pruning is so important. So I'll link that to today's thought. And then I'll go to schools philosophy. Bink. Here's philosophers. There's a scroll bar down here. That's just A through E. I never took a course in philosophy. I can barely read philosophy, but I know that it's really important. And so here's Lawrence Joseph Henderson, who was a physiologist, a sociologist, wrote The Fitness of the Environment, blah, blah, blah. And I went to schools of philosophy because there is nominalism, neo-Kantianism, the pre-Socratics, Gaia philosophy, the gymnosophists, et cetera, et cetera. These are really interesting things to me. And so, and the gymnosophists actually have connected to nudists. That's really interesting. And for me, I'm always sort of building what's happening. And so when I say we are now in the GPT world, here's hot questions, I'm really interested in, will AI, here's generative AI endangers humanity. This question, ever since like last December when ChatGPT got hot, this became a really important question. And there've been a whole bunch of, here's the pause, here's the open letter to everybody to, nope, we need to stop doing this. That's really, really interesting to me. And I have people's rejections of this thesis, the people who supported that it caused a whole bunch of other conversations. We brought it up on several of our the calls that I host. So here it is on a Free Jerry's Brain call. On Mondays, if anybody wants to geek around, Mondays at 1 p.m. Pacific, there's a standing call called Free Jerry's Brain. Ping me and I will invite you to it. But for me, this is a thinking tool and a memory aid. And my wet onboard memory is much better. My unaided recall is much better than it would be, because every time I add something to my outboard brain or consult it to go find something, I'm refreshing neural paths in here. And so I'm relying on it pretty heavily for a whole bunch of heavy lifting of very different kinds, I think.
And that's very similar comment to what Sasha told us a few weeks ago on the Zettelkasten. And that he said, I've been using my Zettelkasten, my archive, for so long that my brain's kind of wired to it. So if I lost it tomorrow, I wouldn't freak out too much because it's already kind of there. And that symbiotic relationship back and forth between the two is very similar to what you just said.
Yep.
But I wonder how much the tool facilitates this very easy, quick capture of a very shallow data point. and does not necessarily facilitate a deeper reflection on whatever it is you truly find interesting. So, for instance, if I was looking into serendipitous connections between the 5 stages of grief and Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, that this came about accidentally through reading disparate sources, but then I could dive deeper into those and do a lot of reflection and learning that informed kind of my view of life. And I'm not sure that I wonder. Yeah, I'm looking at this now. It's very attractive, isn't it?
You're saying sort of shallow versus depth. I think I feel like this lets me run extremely deep. So, for instance, recently I started reading The Heroine of 1,001 Faces by Maria Tatar. It's really good. And the first thing she does is drive a knife under the shield of Joseph Campbell. And she's like, hey, how come the women give birth to the men? They're the reward at the end of the journey. They're the temptresses along the way, but they never actually get to take the journey. What's going on here? And that's her opening salvo, and it's awesome. And I think those things are fabulous. And this builds a thesis that I've had for a long time. We've been suffering from a yang overdose for 300 to 3,000 years. I entered this in 2003. So what it does is evidence and ideas accrue. And even though these are short phrases, I really care about being precise and concise. Brevity really matters to me. Michelle Bowens does the Peer-to-Peer Foundation wiki, and he's been using basically MediaWiki for as long as I've been using the brain, except I go into that wiki and there are just too many words. That's not boiled down. And I'm trying as hard as possible to boil. And I want the full text to be outboard somewhere else and some other document. And I read lots of long form stuff, and then I come back here and I try to boil it down and distill it. So I'm doing lots and lots of editorial and distilling. And it feels like I'm going deep, although I may not be deep at all. And it just may be me fooling myself.
Well, but Jerry, could you elaborate a little more? You said you use it you said something about heavy thinking or heavy lifting a few minutes ago. Could you give some examples of how you use it to inform your life?
Sure. Right now I'm trying to stand up a talk to sell to make a living off of because I realized from 25 years of using the brain that I'm more of a cyborg than anybody I know. So I'm doing confessions of a cyborg. And it's like, well, how do I think about this? Well, here's potential confessions posts. These are things that I want to do short videos, basically YouTube shorts about. One of them is machine intelligence is going to eat work task by task. This is under the future of work, where I have a whole bunch of different thoughts. There's a lot to think about on the future of work. Here's, for example, 21st century job titles, things that are going to be popular coming up. But I'm busy planning this Confessions of a Cyborg thing. And here I've got a bibliography of related articles. I want to create episodes of a podcast series, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Here's what being a cyborg has been like. So I've got that connected to lessons from my brain, but also to a couple of popular culture tropes, like Sigourney Weaver in Aliens and things like that.
Okay, good. That's very helpful. Thank you.
And does the brain have any mobile support?
The brain, so they've just redid the web client, which kind of obsoletes the app. There was an app in the App Store. In the iOS App Store, there's an app called Jerry's Brain that has my face on it. It doesn't sell at all because one problem with it is that it's frozen in 2016. And I like to say that version of my brain never learned that Donald Trump won the election. So it has like this kind of a merciful kind of sense to it. But there's no naturalistic photographs in the App Store, but my face is in there, which is kind of fun. But that's all sort of been deprecated. They just rewrote the web client, and it runs on kind of anything. It's usually a smartphone doesn't have enough screen real estate to do the brain well, but you can kind of get around now in it.
Or like in a tablet, you could pull up, and if you're in a meeting, you could
works great on a tablet.
Hammering stuff in, yeah.
Works great in a tablet. Yeah.
Okay.
And I wish that I could use Google Assistant or some speech reco to say, you know, add this, do this, find this, take this. If I had speech control over it and I've got a long wish list of things that the brain doesn't do that I wish it did. And I wish it collaborated really nicely with other tools, because it turns out I can't understand how to do Kumu diagrams. Kumu.io is a great systems mapping tool. If you wanted to figure out the food ecosystem in the Pacific Northwest, or poverty and homelessness, you would want to use Kumu. And Gene Bellinger, who is a Kumu black belt, spent a couple hours on Zoom during the pandemic trying to teach me Kumu. It turns out I don't know how to speak Kumu. He would say, "How about this?" And I would make something, and then he would like draw the elf in full rendition. I'd be like, I wasn't even thinking like that. But I think that the problems we're looking at in the world require different sets of tools depending on what you're trying to get done. And one of the conclusions I have from trying to figure out how do we interoperate is we all need to separate the data from the tools. We need a layer of rich data that I think of as soil. Like soil makes a really nice metaphor here, and mycelium and fungi make a really nice metaphor here, because if I improve the node for Lynn Ostrom, and then you come in using Tinderbox and look at the same node, but it's been made better, and you approve anything that I add, you're good with because you trust me, we have just built some wisdom together, even though we were coming in with different tools. I want that world. But to do that, we need kind of access to each other's data instead of the data being siloed under each of the tools.
You need to collaborate. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how these pieces are coming together. So in my world, I'm in the we should talk offline about the trust stuff, because
Cool.
I do all of my work in the privacy and personal information management space. So I'm spending a lot of time with Tim Berners-Lee and his team and the personal data store movements on how we're separating content from the platforms that control our content. And you know, the idea is dropping hubs in all of our IoT devices, so that, you know, data produced by the IoT first goes to my hub, and then I can choose to where it goes, as opposed to the manufacturer of the IoT device. You know, things like that.
Cool.
And you know, that's privacy preserving, but it's also data controlling, and then that allows us to then have that facility. And there might be some areas for us to collaborate on that.
I'd love that. You just triggered a separate thing, which is we talked about a little bit in the Meetup chat before, and sort of the run up to this, which was the difference between a second brain and maybe a third brain. And I did a podcast with Tiago Forte, who does Building a Second Brain, and learned in the podcast that his second brain is his private external memory. His third brain is whatever he decides to publish from that. And I was like, wait, what? Because in my brain, I just hit sync several times a day, and it syncs all my new data to the server. And I have to take an extra step to mark something private to make anything private. And I do that less than 0.5% of the time. So very few things in my brain are marked private. So everything I'm thinking about is meant for the commons as well as for me for the future, on purpose. And I'm trying to figure out, why aren't more of us doing this? Because we're not going to figure out how to get our way out from under climate change and racism and all these other things unless we share more info.
I don't know, Angie, you have a thought on that, since you're the commons expert?
Yeah.
Why the base question? Because I had a question about the base question of why aren't more people doing it? We've all grown up in a system that says the more I hoard, the more chance I have to develop this product that I end up selling to Microsoft or Google, and they pay me crap loads of money for it.
Oh, I missed the crap loads of money part.
Students,
yeah.
All my students would tell you that. Why would I share this? There's a chance I sell it. You know, I mean, it's painful. It's painful to hear. Yeah. Where there's obviously there's a whole, you know, the fun part about it is there are whole disciplines, quite honestly, that are very much open to the idea of knowledge should be open. But that's, you know, right now still viewed as sort of these cult industries, although quite honestly, they're the only ones that are going to save us. You know, I remind my business students all the time, I'm like, yeah, you and your money can somehow produce air, you know, food, you know, that type of conversation. But yeah, it's bad. You know, I had a question though as well on this. So what would you do if someone was not as intelligent and committed to robustness of the discipline as you are, and created a crappy brain that then got caught in the current, you know, world of I'm lazy and I stole your search proxy, basically.
So
What if I'm an evil person? I create an evil brain that sort of I paid attention to it, but I didn't know what the hell I was doing. ChatGPT catches onto it, it grabs it, and it now has a whole bunch of misinformation linked together into some really dodgy sources and crappy places.
So there's
Sounds
several
like a
different.
outline for a caper film.
Whoop, I missed that. Say
Sounds
that
like
again.
a plot line for a caper film, which I totally.
Oh yeah, no, it does. It does.
Yeah.
Or a Cory Doctorow, right? This
Yeah,
is this could
exactly.
be his next book. You know, what happens when I'm a malicious evildoer and I create these mind map, elaborate mind maps that, only have certain, sunken holes that are like really detrimental.
We could call the novel Chat Away.
Yeah.
So let me try to answer, because you've asked several different questions kind of together. One of them is,
sorry.
one of them is the ChatGPT generative AI Ouroboros problem. If the snake
Okay.
eats its own tail, there's a thought in my brain that are we at peak knowledge right now? And
Yeah.
somebody wrote a very nice post that said, hey, it's entirely possible that all these fictions are now going to enter the search space and we won't be able to distinguish between them.
Right.
That is a huge problem. I totally agree. I can't solve that. That's like beyond my pay grade right now.
Right.
The thing I wish to have that would blend the brain with Tinderbox, with Kumu, with other sorts of things, would have a space within which data would be shared, and I could then exclude or include data from other people depending on whether or not I trusted them.
Yeah.
And one of the important criteria for me is I have to have like the red emergency button that I hit when I'm overwhelmed and I back out to see only what I added to the map. Which is what I have right now in the brain, because I'm the only dude who's added anything to my particular brain file. But I want my brain file to be mingled with. I would like my brain data file to be a mycelial inoculant for the global brain. I own the domain thebigfungus.org because I think a funny name for the global brain is good. And I want to inoculate the big fungus and have other people do the same and have us find our way into the middle so that there can be fruiting bodies we can all feed off of, right? Called mushrooms. And we're not doing that yet. And I'd love to do that with you all.
The fungus that turns us all into zombie ants, right?
This is not the cordyceps thing. Yeah, ignore the cordyceps in the corner.
Got it.
I've not been watching The Last of Us, mostly because the zombie genre spooks me too much, and I can't go there.
Yeah, it's pretty good. Yeah,
I've heard it's really well done.
Angie, anything else there? Anything?
No, that was both my response and my sad response on how humanity's going to die because we all chase cash. But nonetheless, you answered my question. Thank you.
But that does really raise an interesting point, just existentially though, and how do we move from this capitalistic primary driven GDP growth mindset to one of purpose, and we learned, I don't know who told me in this group, but David Fleming wrote a book that really talked about the fact that at some point, if we're only chasing growth, just naturally and logically, you realize that at some point the resources for growth dry up. And so therefore, inevitably, we will have collapse. And so therefore, how do we manage that collapse down the road, which leads us more to like an Asimovian foundation model, where if we are conscious about it, we can have 10,000 years of pain instead of 50,000 years of pain. Like, how do we do that? And I don't think we as a society really figured that out yet.
Not at all.
Mr. Anderson, your hand's been up.
Yeah, I'm going to drop a thought. When I heard Jerry's coming on this, I was sort of reading around a bit, and amongst other things I lightened on, I'll put a link in a moment. And it was Jerry at a thing called Render, I think it was last year, which was kind of a little maker fair. But at the very end, you were talking with Esther Dyson, and I was very struck by a question from the audience. And this plays into your point about, well, different tools for different things. It being a thing of makers and it being about tools for thought, somebody asked about blocks, which I think is Rome speak for addressable items of knowledge. It's an opinionated view of the world, but it's one that's out there. And I was very taken by her answer, because she said the question was, so what do you think about blocks? And she says, well, but what's so important about blocks? Isn't what is between the blocks more important? And this, to me, is a really interesting sort of bridge link between the power I see going on here in the brain, and this ability to move around all these very large number of thoughts very quickly, and the sort of more micro level stuff that perhaps one's doing in a Tinderbox map, where even putting a link on the page I can find can be destructive, because often I find I use a map almost like a jigsaw. You put the blue bits away from the red bits, but you don't know how they connect, but you know that the light red bits are more red than the green bits, which is a very different way of approaching what might be links to exactly the sort of thing that is you might put into your brain, but you're using them a different way. And also it leaves room for negative space, dark thoughts, in a positive sense, that is, not dark thoughts. But I don't know if you had a thought on that, Jerry.
Sorry, which piece of that?
Oh, sorry.
That was really interesting, except I missed where you wanted me to focus on.
Yeah, right. It was just thinking that when she made that point about, well, actually, it's a relationship between the things, and I was wondering what your thought was in terms of, as you I think rightly say, well, different tools for different things, and that's not something that you're necessarily doing in the brain, because what you've got there are a lot of connections which you can move around very fast, and you have a sort of associative space that has a distinct meaning to you that helps orientate you. But for instance, if you needed to rearrange those thoughts in a different way, you might need to move into a different sort of tool space. Would that be a fair comment?
Possibly. I mean, I evolved a couple of what I call cliches. It's probably not the best word. Let's maybe call them tropes or something like that, which is I always put authors above their posts and books and whatever. I always put actors under their movies because they're acting in a movie. And if the movie is dependent on a novel, then I put the novel above the movie. And I've been consistent in those little tropes for 25 years. So in different places, there's a lot of context that's really easily understood by the human eye once you figure out some of my tropes, right? You're like, oh, and with, so for example, when I started using this software, I was a tech industry trends analyst, and who invested in whom? Now, Andreessen Horowitz didn't exist yet when I was doing this job, but Andreessen Horowitz invested in BuzzFeed. So did Lara Hippo Ventures. Oh yeah, they're Eric Hippo, right? He was the guy from Ziff Davis. Oh, okay. And if I go back to Andreessen Horowitz, they also invested in Canvas in 2010. That's an image board. So are these others, and there's other names. I can't do this in a different tool. I don't know how to search through the space this fast. And I will say that as soon as I started using the brain, I'd get a call from a journalist saying I'm writing an article about instant messaging or buddy lists, and I would just sit down at my computer and type buddy lists, and here are all the buddy lists I've ever heard of. Skype, of course, ScreenFire, Pip, PeopleLink. Most of these are dead. Most of these are long gone, but I can tell you what date I put them in my brain. I can give you a link to go to the archive. I put this in my brain in January of '98. So basically, one of the first things I put in was this company right here. And PIP is different from partner interface process, which is part of XML, which I noticed one day. So can't do this in a different tool.
Yeah, no, indeed. Just to round out, because I wasn't making, unless I appeared to say so, it wasn't about a qualitative judgment. I was just thinking about how you the point at which if the analysis you want to make or the association you want to make is almost relative, so, rather than a link.
And I apologize, I sort of wandered off your question.
No.
I believe in the relationships tremendously. So for example, in 2010, I started a mastermind group called the Relationship Economy Expedition, because I think that we're coming back into relationship, we're beginning to understand relationships again. And the thing I think I love about the brain a lot is that it shows me the relationships as almost more important than the content of any particular node. The content of a node is there and I can go look at it, but really what is the context is always the place I'm going. A month or two ago, we tried to connect my brain data exported into a NoSQL database to GPT basically in some way. And we discovered that I don't use the notes field, so there's not a lot of text to play with. And we didn't know and couldn't solve how to teach GPT to infer what I just told you about from the structure that I use in my brain. So we stalled out, couldn't get anything done. And I'm like, damn it, because I really would love to make that link, right?
So-
I think that's the superpower.
So, and again, this is really interesting. I mean, I want to go back to one of the points that Mark had just said in his question to you. He was referring to an Esther Dyson comment about sometimes the links are more important than the nodes, than the objects, which absolutely reflects, Mark, if you don't recall, we were, when I was sitting at Mark Anderson's dinner table a couple weeks ago in London or in Portsmouth, we started talking about Ted Goranson. And so from the table, I said, hey, Ted, let's meet. So I got to meet Ted last week. And incredible mind in this space. And what Ted and I discussed last week was very similar to Mark's question. And what he brought up is there's two concepts: set theory, which is really around using objects and connecting one object to another and seeing that Venn diagram overlay, that how does this object and this object relate to each other? And that's what physics and our software and everything's really built on today. And then what Ted was saying, though, is that's kind of run its course in society, he believes, and that we need to circle back to what the other part of the internet was supposed to be, which was category theory, which was what are the interdimensional relationships that get in the context that is derived from the link types. And if we realize that one object and another object will not just necessarily have an overlay, but in theory could have multiple different types of links, and those links and those link types create context, and that context is where meaning happens and where change will happen in society. And that's kind of where his current projects are going. And so I'm thinking you might want to catch up with Ted based on what where your ChatGPT project stalled out, because that's very similar to what he's working on. And his comment, and for Mr. Bernstein, you may appreciate this, is his comment was to his understanding, Tinderbox is the only tool in the world right now that allows you to have multi-directional links and then to be able to dynamically change the names of those links, which then can trigger any number of different actions. By the way, I have a automated affirmation tool in Tinderbox that triggers.
Oh, good. I was wondering if God was speaking to us.
No, it is God. I built an automated affirmation tool in Tinderbox.
So cool.
So every 90 minutes, it gives me a random affirmation
to
tell me to love myself and love the world. So it
well done.
Helps. Yeah, Kim's shaking his head. Yeah, it's silly, but it is what it is. It makes me laugh. It's a good thing. So, but I think there's something to be said with that. This transition between this idea of us working with objects to this idea of working with the relationships between objects and the types. And again, just to finish off, what Ted was saying is he is aware. He's not aware of any other software other than Tinderbox that allows you to have those multi-directional links between objects and have action code that can actually let you dynamically change the types of those links, and then the actions that are triggered once those link types change. Because for Ted, it was really about the transformational relationship that can happen between objects when you actually start managing link types. So long story preamble, but I'm wondering if that's kind of where you were going, Mr. Anderson, with your question too, of this distinction between objects and link types.
Sort of yes and no. I'll finish a comment I was putting. The other thing is just is what isn't on the graph. So a problem with a lot of PKM tools at the moment is it gives you a graph. In a sense, it sort of tells you what you knew already. It doesn't. I mean, the recall part, and this is what I think is spectacular to watch in the brain now, is remarkably powerful. But by the time you've taken something and reorganized it for the purpose of following the link, you may not necessarily see the relationship so well. And I don't want to be hard-edged about that at all. It's definitely not my binary judgment I'm implying here. It's this interesting thing of at what point do you need to flop from sort of almost one display to another, because the sort of investigation you're doing is slightly different, and basically leaving space for the dark matter. So why are these things not connected? Not in the simplistic sense that I haven't created a line on a screen between them, but I feel these things should be closer together in my system, and they aren't. And why is that? That's sort of one of the things. And I thought that was rather what Esther's answer was pointing towards in the talk that I mentioned, and I'll stick a link to that in the sidebar. So I'm not sure I've clarified enough there.
Thank you. I'll take a really brief attempt at answering. And I think part of this conversation is above my pay grade, because I have set theory and category theory in my brain, but I really couldn't tell you how they relate and what's what and how they fit. And really I don't know. And every now and then I hit somebody who's found a theory or a really clean diagram that explains everything, and then they explain everything in terms of that one diagram, and it starts to become a limiting thing instead of a liberating thing. It's very strange how that sometimes plays out. So I'm leery of one framework to rule them all or anything like that. It's kind of hard. Separately, I believe that like energy is matter is energy trapped in fields, and we are a noun-based culture. We have a noun first language. There are a bunch of verb first languages like Navajo. A bunch of Native American languages are verb languages. David Bohm, the physicist, invented Rio mode, an experimental language, which was a verbish language. And there's a bunch of other attempts to look at the relationships instead of the objects in that way. And I like those, and I'm out of my depth already. And then I'll say that when I said earlier that we're going to have a variety of tools that need to collaborate better, and I just put the word seamfulness into the chat. Years ago, somebody said, we need seamless design of software and all that. And then someone else critiqued and said, nope, nope, nope. We need seamful design. We need the mindful edges to be visible so that I know that, if I tried to do what's easily doable in Kumu for systems diagramming in the brain, I would flop. It would fail. It's not good at that. And I would love to be able to be looking at some data and go, oh, now I need to switch over into Kumu mode and maybe get an AI assistant that's really smart at doing systems diagramming and help me do that. And now we're talking. And now I actually need a semi-structured database that does something different. But I'm still looking at this layer of soil that we've been nurturing together and we trust because we've each been curating it with care. So something more like that.
Jerry, that makes me think of something, another World War II story. Is coming out of World War II, the US was trying to make the next best fighter jet. And they realized that, so they built this incredible plane and the plane didn't work and the pilots couldn't fly it. And what they realized is they built the plane for the average. And so no one could use it. And because the pilots couldn't fit. And so then they had to go back and say, no, we need to build for the edges, build for those seams, as you were saying. And once they did that, they invented like the adjustable seat. So a pilot of a different height could actually get in the plane and use it.
So the book you're talking about is The End of Average. Here is the USAF realized the pilots weren't average in size, adjustments lowered accident rates, and a lot of the plot I sort of took in notes here. He talks about the jaggedness principle, the pathways principle, and a bunch of other things I don't remember putting in my brain. But he talks about Adolphe Quetelet, and he wrote a thing called The Average Man. He took a bunch of stats, and the idea of an average human comes out of his research, etc. This is how I note take.
Very cool. Mr. Bernstein had his hand up too. So let's let Mr. Bernstein go because he had his hand up.
Going back to the diagrammatics of these tools, unless I'm hallucinating, which I may be, in the very early days at least, the brain used a hyperbolic browser, like
it's like Xerox Insight, INXIGHT, had a hyperbolic browser, I think, back in the day. The brain has alternate displays. It has an outline mode and a kind of rubber bandy mode, like a force field mode, but never a hyperbolic tree mode.
Okay, because I remember they had a patent, and I remember looking at the announcement of their patent and trying to figure out what they'd patented that wasn't in the Stefik Xerox PARC patent. And at that point, I said, I'll put a note in my tickler file to return to hyperbolic geometry in 17 years. But maybe they didn't actually deploy it in the product.
Entirely possible. And I know that early on the brain was pretty litigious because they were trying to protect their space and they would darken the sky with lawyers. I'm maybe sort of overstating this when somebody was getting too close to them. Angie, you were in the queue a little earlier. Did you have a question or did you?
He went down the path that we were talking about the other day. So I was curious about what Michael was talking about. So you answered it. Thank you.
Sweet. Thank you. Bruce?
Hi, good morning. This is fantastic, by the way. Thank you.
what I find myself thinking about is that you and others have amassed in various ways all of this information. And you mentioned earlier that, people are putting in links for interviews, people are talking about books, people are, you mentioned having a podcast. And so I think of these kind of ode to Michael Becker, these are all output systems, if you will. This is the publishing part. And it makes me think about, as I'm trying to disseminate information, I'm a psychologist, and so I'll talk to teachers and teams and that kind of thing. And it's interesting. I recently ran a group with developmentally disabled adults, and apparently, I don't know what it says about me, but apparently I was a big hit, and they can't wait for me to come back. So in other words, what I took away from that is that I found a way of presenting at their level, and I connected with them. And many times when I do presentations, I work really hard at it. I hate using PowerPoint, and sometimes I use it anyway. I recently was reading about readable videos, and so there's no sound, there's no music. Through Common Craft, they're doing that. And my long-winded question to you is, have you decided upon a way of presenting your voluminous information in a way that connects with your audience and causes changes in belief or acquisition of knowledge that is retained? Because what I keep seeing, and this may apply to others, but I keep seeing that the information is spewed out there, if you will, but it's not necessarily absorbed and managed and turned into something thoughtful. And I see that, I'll stay apolitical, but the trend is not getting better. Thanks, Bruce. Awesome, thoughtful question. There's a bunch of different things. My favorite storytelling tool, I think storytelling is hugely important. And there's a thought in my brain that says, we're in a titanic battle over the narratives in our heads. And that's what politics is kind of all about. It's like, how do I convince people that trickle down is more important than taking care of people or whatever else it might be? And so storytelling matters. And my favorite storytelling was Prezi. I was not using the brain very much for storytelling. And Prezi, I was there when they launched, and then went there when they made the tool over long ago, and it eliminated the nice zebra menu thing. And then they did a second makeover that basically lobotomized the tool entirely. And I went back in and tried to play with Prezi like I used to. I used to be able to make it sing, and I couldn't make it do jack. And it really made me sad. So I haven't found a Prezi replacement. I can't find a thing that makes me as happy as Prezi for storytelling. I don't really like Miro and Mural and all those things. They don't really work for me, and they don't do Prezi. And I don't mean the spinning. I just mean the ability to construct a narrative and so forth. So I'm busy looking for what the heck is the storytelling tool that makes this all kind of glue together, that allows each of us collecting and obsessively sort of squirreling away and synthesizing things that we care about with our favorite tools, what makes it easier for us to express these in a more digestible way for what I call muggles, civilians who are not expert in any of these tools and don't need to be and shouldn't have to be, right? Well, your comment about storytelling actually resonates, because I've been told that's one of my most effective presentation methods. When I talk about a clinical case, when I bring up something that captures people. And so I remembered to include that in my presentations. But something just occurred to me, and yes, I used Prezi, I guess, before they lobotomized it. And once you tone down the animations and some of the other things, I did love it. It was more compatibility issues, because a lot of conferences I present at require that you send them a PowerPoint.
Yeah.
And it just maddens me that that's the case. So really what you're talking about, if I'm understanding, is a tool that supports your presentation style and allows you to connect, rather than you having to shoehorn your presentation style into the tool that has been selected either by you or others.
Right. And also, I realize that when I show a lot of stuff on screen, I know where the thread is, and I'm trying to like walk you through the thread of the story I'm trying to tell, but there's just way too much information also on screen. What I love about the brain and its context is that I can drop, like I just did, I just dropped a link to, we are in a titanic battle over the narratives in our heads, and we've always been, in the chat.
anybody who wants to take the time can now go wander around in there. And my experience is some large chunk of people who go wander in my brain and spend a little time soaking in how I think I've organized stuff usually kind of get there and they can sort things out. And I get a lot of really interesting emails back because the brain, of course, doesn't let them communicate with me. But I get interesting messages back in different ways from people that said, oh, I noticed you have this, but not this. Have you thought about this? Have you read this book? Whatever it might be. And I love that because I go digest that and put it back in the brain. I would rather we were just sort of meeting in the big fungus and connecting these things together there. And there's way too much for all of us to read. Can we just please each digest these things as best we can, and then figure out more accurately which things we all really want to read and digest further and go in depth on? Because my reading list is way too long, and probably all of yours is too.
Yeah, and it sounds
Just
like
to follow up with one last
back-
point and then turn myself off. What you just said completely is inconsistent with the way that all these presentations work, in that the presentation is either given and people can watch the 1 hour recording afterward. But the idea, or they give them a list of 25 resources and citations to look at. And all of those are kind of what I think of as the brick way of providing information. What I've tried to do most recently is to take highlights of my presentations and create 2 to 3 minute snippets of them on different topics, and allow people, it's not really hyperlinking, but to allow people to have a little bit of a menu and sometimes I just do it as simply as Google Docs mapping out to then Google videos. And that's, I've gotten some nice feedback about that. So anyway, let me turn it over to others, but it's not just for you, it's a collective area where, so many of us are doing presentations and lectures and trying to connect with our audience. And obviously the technology has changed how students absorb information. I'm planning my summer program right now with 50 students, and the ones I worry about the most are the teenagers. And number one, they can't use their phone for 7 hours. So that's a plus. And once they go through withdrawal, they actually begin to converse and pay attention. And then other people come up and go, what the hell's going on? Because they see teenagers talking and laughing without a phone. And that's an anomaly.
Hopefully you have Narcan on hand for when they have withdrawal symptoms.
What? Can you repeat?
Hopefully you have Narcan on hand for when they suffer the withdrawal symptoms.
I have a therapy dog on hand.
Oh, perfect. Much better. Yeah. I put a link in the presentation to an unlisted video I did, which isn't very polished at all, but it's trying to describe the fact that books and presentations should just be playlists. And I got this idea a couple decades back, and the same friend who helped me frame the brain, Kenneth Tyler of SeedWiki fame, except SeedWiki's gone, he also helped me play with this. And imagine that you have a wiki space where you have a wiki page that you say, this is going to be a presentation table of contents. And then there's a big button on it you put on it that makes it a presentation. You hit play. It basically goes to full screen and then plays the pages that you've listed on the table of contents page in the order you've put them in. And you could then imagine a fancier slide sorter or whatever, but that's your table of contents. Now, every slide in your new deck is now just a wiki page. And you can imagine overlaying themes or other sorts of, or transitions or whatever else you want. But that means that great slide that you use over and over again, which deck was it in, is no longer a question. You find your way to it and you just pick the version you want, and you might fork it or whatever. But it also means that you could share the same interesting page with a bunch of different people. So there might be a short segment that explains how ChatGPT works, that if we publish this openly in a medium where presentation decks are just playlists of pages that we're sharing, then other people could use the same materials and keep going. We don't have that world. I want that world. That's the like how do we build tools that get us to share stuff so that we can do storytelling collectively?
Well, Angie, isn't that kind of the world you want too? Let's stop trying to make money just off of the creation of that list and make money from the wisdom and value we bring to society in our narratives.
Yeah, so we do a bunch of books in areas called the Knowledge Commons, which is actually Brett Frischman, Mike Madison, sort of that group, with that commitment in mind. And we actually, as part of the original author promise, or editors, I guess, promise, we fund open source books. So, they're they're all open source, they're all everything. They don't map necessarily in the way that you're exactly, speaking of. But they are, academic and case studies in particular areas, and they're all open source. They're online, digitally open source and stuff. And so there is a group of us who are very committed to that. Very, very committed to that. So yeah, in an ideal world, that's what we would do. We would all be one giant library, as opposed to, I use libraries as the example of the, the original idea for this. And we need to get back to that, quite honestly, in my opinion.
Love that. Art?
Mr.
Hi,
Art.
it always takes me a second to find the mute button for some reason, even though I know exactly where it is. So thanks so much for this. It's really, it's wonderful to actually watch you sort of reach for your brain, which I think, and to me, it's one of actually the core aspects of what I'm learning from this. And you have this unabashed and pure commitment to your brain, which is a very, I think, to me, very important part of this entire dynamic, because I do strongly believe that depending on the person, each person finds the way to work and the thing that they want to work with. And there's sort of this odd marriage of skills and predilections and ways of learning, and perhaps to the extent of finding happy accidents. And then when all that comes together to a certain extent, then you have your productivity tool. And it seems to me that you've found the exact right tool for, as you say so many times, for the way you think. And not only that, you're fully committed to it. And I'll say this perhaps at the cost of maybe sounding critical, but it's not coming from there at all. I can sense that, for example, like The Brain as a software app at first flush to someone from the Tinderbox world, it seems actually quite delimited, because there are so many things that are hardwired into it, so many behaviors that the brain sort of forces you to work with its way of doing things. And somehow you found a way to actually to leverage every aspect of that, even to the point, and with very few, I might add, accoutrement. So you have just the two colors of text, for example, and you're keeping it simple so that you keep boiling down to the core of what it is you're trying to reach. And most people actually don't recognize that putting data into a corpus is only 1/10 of the work. 90% is actually knowing that you have something there that you want to add things to, and then part B is, of course, being able to utilize it for the purpose that you're doing. So I think that's, for me, very educational and also very interesting. With Tinderbox, I think I personally have a tendency toward committing to 2 or 3 different or 5 different ways of doing things. So I can often reorganize my data because that's the way my mind happens to be working now. And for me, actually, I cannot let go of that freedom and flexibility. And I just add one point to this, is that in terms of actually being able to export something from the brain that I might be able to use in Tinderbox, I think really the solution lies in the CSV format, because technically you have a note, you have 2 or 3 nodes that are connected to it. So that's sort of telling you, in our world, it's like an attribute. If I were able to export the actual note as well as what's on the left, what's above, what's below, that's almost enough for me to be able to drop the whole thing into Tinderbox and start creating connections and links and throw agents together and rebuild it only to the extent that I need to use Tinderbox for. Personally, I do a lot of large sort of, I tend to sort of glom on, I tend to sort of add on to the basic idea and then build a note into something much larger. And for me, Tinderbox is that exact environment for doing that. I can just keep going and then still find stuff when I need it. In terms of a marriage between the two, I think if I could find a way to, say, export a CSV from time to time from Tinderbox, from the brain, drop it into Tinderbox, and then I will have agents and I will have some mechanism or attributes that will immediately link it to existing maybe essays or larger notes that already exist in my Tinderbox file. Literally, I could look at that CSV as this mini database that I could update and then sync to my Tinderbox files which already exist, and I'm not actually losing any information in the process. I'm just growing it and building it. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks for your observations, Art. I really appreciate how you're seeing and perceiving and reflecting back my quirky and individual use of the tool. And you're very right. I kind of adapted to its quirks right away. And I loved that it didn't force me to create an ontology or a taxonomy. I am not an ontologist. And if it had done that, it wouldn't have led me to the place where I am. I wouldn't have been able to do what I did with it, because it just had one particular little trick, the up, down, left. That was just the one little UI trick. And that I was able to use that to have what Arthur Brock calls expressive capacity beyond other tools that I've found. And again, each of us, my wife has a calendric brain. It's like she's looking at her calendar in front of her. I don't know what I did like 8 days ago without consulting my digital calendar. She can tell us what we did on this day for the last 8 years, right?
Right.
And so each of us needs to, and one of the interesting quests that is unsolved here is, what is the sorting hat that helps us find our way to the right tool for each person, so that the people who are best adapted, who just are going to love Tinderbox, find their way to Tinderbox, and et cetera, for all of the mapping tools for thinking that I shared with you earlier. How do we do that and then come together to play?
Well, I won't want to use that word out here because it's a very very forward kind of group, but I've been kind of profligate with my use of applications over the years, and sort of slowly worked my way to the few now, that the ones that I use, and somehow managed to retain much of my information along the way. And I think for me, Tinderbox has been fantastic, because if I've had a couple of years working in a database program, I've been able to export that data. If I've worked in Word or Numbers or Excel, I've been able to export that data and sort of and build it all together in Tinderbox. But I see exactly what you're saying, and it's probably different, but I may have a day when I'm in an excellent the brain mode, and another day when I'm in a fantastic Tinderbox mode, and that's just basically how my brain works. I don't try to second guess it. But it's an excellent point that you make.
Well, awesome. We're a little bit over, but I want to leave with one question, if you don't mind, Jerry.
Go for it.
Hang us over. So, Melvin talked about how he has multiple brains, and you talk about how you have one brain. In the Tinderbox world, we often talk about, do you have one Tinderbox file or do you have multiple Tinderbox files? So one question I want to have is that idea of one brain or multiple brains. And the follow-on question is, how do you actually do your work? Like, where are you managing output? Where are you writing your papers? Where are you? Because that's another thing within our Tinderbox community. Like, I've personally driven towards, I do 90% of my work in Tinderbox now, including the output, including the linkages, including the organization, because I spent the time to build the templates to understand my data so that I can actually write 450-page reports in Tinderbox and publish them, and also have Tinderbox vocalize that I've done a great job, which is really fun to have it do that. Other people don't. Other people use Tinderbox as a note-taking tool and then use Scrivener or some other tool, which is also great and cool and awesome. How do we balance those things?
So
I guess my question is multiple brains, one brain, managing output.
Yeah. So, and I'll try to answer quickly. I'm very unusual in the brain community in that I've only tended to one brain for a really long time. Everybody else I know does multiples. Mark Trexler of the Climate Web has multiple brains, but he's also making a business out of giving people access to the information he's curated into a brain. So that makes sense. I didn't have any business model I was trying to do. At one point at a conference years ago, somebody said, hey, can you start a brain for me? So I decided, let's do the periodic table of elements. So I started with hydrogen and started building, and we finished our demo. And I looked at it, I'm like, why would you want this separate from everything else? Because everything is deeply intertwinkled, which is the thought I just went, thank you, Ted Nelson. Everything is deeply intertwinkled. Isn't this what we want to do? And so I was showing you, Confessions of a Cyborg earlier, and here's my operations. I have Google Docs down here. And I do lots and lots of stuff on Google Spreadsheets, Google Docs, whatever else it is. I also use Obsidian a bunch, and I'm working with Pete Kaminsky, who is a dear old friend who is kind of the Scotty, Spock, and Data of Open Global Mind, and he has a thing called Massive Wiki, which basically tries to pretend to be a wiki on top of markdown files on GitHub repos. And it doesn't have you pick your favorite markdown editor to edit, and it doesn't do conflict resolution. You've got to figure that out socially. But we're trying to figure out, how do we create the simplest possible substrate of data we can share, regardless what tool you're coming in with. And that's why Markdown. And I know there's flavors of Markdown that came up a little bit earlier. And then I tried writing in Scrivener years ago. I installed it. I have it on my iPad and on my laptop. And then one day I tried to take a chapter from one manuscript and move it to another manuscript. Guess what? It's impossible.
Yeah.
You have to duplicate and delete, or I don't even know how you would do it. And I'm like, what absurdist person came up with that idea? So I dropped Scrivener like a hot rock, and have not been able to rescue my data. I have a problem because I didn't look at it for a couple of years. Now I need to do a little rescue mission, because I wrote a bunch of things in these nice little cards, but it was so limited and so constricted that I couldn't actually generate writing in it. So now I'm trying to figure out, how do I write prose in Obsidian? And I'm cranky here because we really need something like CRDT. We need real-time editing. So the cool thing about Google Docs, Google Wave before it was concurrent editing with multiple writers. Awesome. And it's so transparent and so easy that we get how to do it. How does this exist in a different tool like Obsidian or in some other kind of tool, so that we can collaborate more easily? Because I get a project now, and when we hit the question of what platform to use to collaborate on, that is still, unfortunately, a terrible, thorny question. There is not a good answer. And I am mad that we've been at this for so long, and there's not a simple, powerful answer. Google Docs could have been a wiki if it did namespaces and stuff like that. And at some point years ago, somebody created something called You Need a Wiki, YNAW. I don't know if it's still around. I don't think so. But basically, you would hand it your Google Docs credentials, and it would make it a wiki. And I didn't want to turn over all of my Google Docs to that thing, so I didn't use it. But it was like, Google, why don't you do that? Because we need namespaces and other sorts of things that wikis provide, and that Google Docs doesn't.
And I think that goes back to the comment we were talking about earlier, though, is we need to be able to separate the individual from our content from the platform. And I think that's one of the challenges that the Googles of the world have gotten themselves into, is I don't want Google to be controlling of my identity and my content and then be monetizing me when that should be under my control. And so I think that, if we can start separating the platform from the people, from their content, from the solutions, I think, that's the world I'm trying to work on.
There's also, Pete really loves to use HackMD, and there's other names for it. Like it's also, it was called CodeMD for a while. Now it's also called HedgeDoc. And every now and then it's a little bit like the cone of silence. Actually, I'm going to do this just for fun. So I'm going to connect it to the the cone of silence under Get Smart. But every now and then I'd be like, oh, let's open up a HackMD. And the problem with HackMD is that the URL up on the URL line is not the permanent URL that file is going to live under. And you then need to do this whole runaround to figure out where the file even lives. It's like, makes me sad.
Yeah. All right, Mr. Bernstein, you get our last question, and we'll close for the day, because otherwise,
yeah, I just wanted to make an observation. If the basic essential ante for playing is that you have seamless collaboration with Google Docs and not require sharing your credentials, then there is exactly one software developer who can possibly play: Google. So you've created a monopoly industry
Right.
by construction, without even having Google's wanting a monopoly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the open alternatives have not been able to displace it.
Well,
So-
and the open alternatives never can, because the only way they can establish themselves under these rules is through seamless cooperation with Google without requiring access to your Google data. Can't be done.
Right.
Fascinating.
Bruce is asking about Google having a wiki. Google bought JotSpot and turned it into Google Sites, which I use now as my simple site builder. I tried for a dozen years to love WordPress. I can't stand WordPress. And so it's kind of wiki-ish.
Yeah. And Art, you had your hand up, but we ignored you. You had one final comment.
Oh, no. I think I put it down, but a little late. But
Yeah.
yeah, but I was again remarking exactly case in point that as soon as I said sub-ether edit, not only did Jerry know what the heck it was, but what it had become, which is just, that proves the point. You're committed and you totally know your own brain. It's great.
All right. Well, I don't want this to end, but I think we have to let it run its course. So, Jerry,
Great session, folks.
I'm sorry, Mark.
Great session.
Yeah, no,
Thank you for the invite.
Absolutely.
Yay. Awesome, Jerry. Thank you very much. We'll
Thank
see
you
guys
all.
around.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. Thanks.